Hey there, I'm Daniel, the low budget outdoorsman. Today, no fishing, but I was going to cut a tree for you. It's getting to be that time of year when the sap's out of the trees. You may be cutting some firewood to let it set for next year, or cutting some wood just to use as project wood. I've got this tree out here in the yard that's started to die this year, so it needs to come down if it's going to be good for anything. And so it's got a little bit of a lean down this hill, but I wanted to show you how to cut a tree on a back lean, or better yet, back weighted tree. So watch me cut this tree, and then I'll explain to you what I did. Well, that was a little bit more work than I anticipated, because I messed up here and I drove this wedge in. I didn't stack them, and this one was too long and it came up against my hinge. I should have slid it in at this angle here with it stacked like this, and then put these two little spacers in there. And put that one in like that, and stack this one on, and then had this one slid in and stack this one on top, and it would have came right over. But anyways, I had to go get an axe to use as a wedge. So how did I know I could take this tree from leaning down the hill and drop it up the hill? Well, first I had to know how tall the tree was. The tree was approximately 60 feet tall. To calculate how far you can swing the tree, first you need a good hinge. So you'll estimate based on how wide your hinge is going to be. I cut a little bit lower than waist high so I could get a little bit more wood. And I've got 17 inches there. So I'm going to use about 10% of that for my hinge. 1.7 inches approximately for a hinge. Now when I cut into it, I knew that this side was going to be a little bit wet. I saw a little rotten spot there. I could tell it was just on this side, not all the way to the edge. I still had good hinge wood on the edge, but right in here. And that's why when I exited this way as opposed to that way. And technically I shouldn't have crossed over behind the tree like that, but it was going this way, and I knew I was out of the way before it could be dangerous. But I knew if it was going to snap and lose it off of 90 degrees or back in the wrong direction, this was the weak part of the hinge. So if it was going to snap in the wrong direction, which it really wasn't going to, but if it were, this part of the hinge would have broken first. And so if anything, it would have been a swing cut where it would have broke here and swung that way. That's why I didn't exit the tree that way. That's why I chose that direction to exit. So 60 feet, we're looking for segments. Now, if this is a 17-inch segment, 17 inches up the tree is one segment. So if I lift the tree, if this is a 1-inch block here, and I lift it 1 inch right here, I've lifted this 17-inch segment right here. I've lifted the tree 1 inch right there. But I've lifted it 2 inches if I go another segment, and so on. If I have 30 segments, then with 1 inch of lift down here, I have swung the tree 30 inches at the top. So this was a little bit over 60-foot tree. So if this were 20-inch segments, then that would be 30. So with 2 wedges, which I didn't need didn't quite need 2, with 2-inch lift here, that would have been 60 inches of swing. So I could have brought, if the center of gravity was 5 feet outside the tree and I had 2 inches of lift, I could have brought the tree 5 feet this way. Now, a lot of times people think of lean, but it's more the weight. As you saw before the tree fell, it had to be leaning well over this way because most of the weight was on this side. So you have to get the weight past the center of gravity, not the trunk. I had to play around and hammer some more wedges than I wanted to because I was up against this here and wasn't going anywhere. So I should have used my other shorter wedges instead of my long wedges. But how to know it's safe is you have to have a good hinge, and you probably don't want to go more than 6 or 7 feet. This tree was in a safe direction. In any direction it could have fallen, so this was a good tree to show you how to do this. Now, did I do a few things wrong? Yes, my hinge is a little bit thicker right here. My back cut was perfect. Out here, I gave it a little bit of a rounded, thicker cut just because of this rotten stuff, and that ended up making me have to work harder to pry free this back part of the hinge. But my biggest problem was I just didn't put my wedges in the right spot, so I had to work harder on that. But when you're going to cut a back-leaning tree, you need to understand these segments. So you're going to, how wide your hinge is going to be, and your hinge, usually it's approximately about 1/3 of the tree. You'll cut out for your relief cut. So you'll measure that or estimate that. And so if that's 17 inches, like I said, your hinge, you're going to want to cut about 10 to 15% of the length of your hinge. The width of your hinge will be about 10 to 15% of the length of your hinge, which is the diameter where you're going to cut the tree at. You'll set your hinge, come back to your strap. That way you put your wedges in, then cut your strap. Your strap, then there will be no rocking in the tree. The tree, once you cut your strap, will be sitting on your wedges. But anyways, that is how you fell a tree opposite to its lean or opposite to its weight. As a disclaimer, I'm not telling you to use any of these techniques. You are not certified to do this just by the University of YouTube. However, I recommend you take a class on specifically how to fell trees, either through the U.S. Forestry or an arborist. Taking a class was one of the best things that I did to understand how to read a tree, what to look for, bore cut technique to make sure you have good wood when you're going to cut a tree that has some potential rot in it. There's a lot of factors, not just the hinge length, width, that have to go into it. And sometimes there's always the potential for something to not go right. And so understanding what the tree might do if it does the worst case scenario is also something to think about. And you oftentimes won't be able to learn that unless you take a good class from a good instructor who's seen about the worst case scenario before. And like I said, on this tree, worst case scenario was most likely this side of the hinge break and it pop either off in this direction, and if it popped this way, the weight was going back that way. So if it popped here, it would have lost back in that direction. That's why, like I said, normally you want to exit out at those 45s. I didn't want to exit a 45 that way, because if this tree came off of here in the absolute worst case scenario, it was going back that way. That's why I crossed over the backside and exited that way, which by the textbook isn't right. I didn't have the leverage to swing backhanded though, which you shouldn't swing offhand. You should set yourself up where your strong hand is your exit. But like I said, sometimes you can't do that because of how the tree sets up. I hope this has been informative, and if nothing else, I hope you've realized that there's more to think about when cutting a tree down than just put a notch and start to cutting. So if you aren't aware of all of these things, and you aren't aware of what can go wrong, and inevitably something will go wrong at some point in time, and you just have to do your best to prepare to think about what is the worst case scenario. And if the worst case scenario is something that you can't live with, then you don't need to be putting a saw to that tree. You need to hire a professional. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'll get back to doing some fishing or some wild game pursuit here before too long. I'm Daniel, the Low Budget Outdoorsman. God bless.